They were promised work. Some were told they'd become nurses. Others believed they'd help feed soldiers at the front. But what awaited them was a locked room, a line of men, and no way out. During World War II, the Japanese Imperial Army enslaved an estimated 200,000 women under the term comfort women. Most were teenagers. Many were never seen again. Their stories were buried in shame, denied by governments, and erased from textbooks. But silence is not the same as forgetting. And now we remember. They came with posters, uniforms, and promises. Sometimes it was a Japanese soldier with a translator, other times a local collaborator with a forged government letter. They visited poor villages across Korea, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, and beyond, places already broken by war and hunger. They said the empire needed workers. Young women could help the troops by serving tea, cooking, cleaning. Some girls saw it as an opportunity to escape poverty. Others were taken by force. One Korean woman, then just 13, recalled how she was snatched off the road and thrown into a military truck. Her parents never knew what happened to her. In other cases, whole families were tricked. They signed forms they couldn't read, giving up their daughters to what they thought was factory work. But the factories never existed. What waited was a military brothel, often nothing more than a shack near the front lines, guarded by armed men. The girls were told they were now part of the war effort, that their sacrifice was for the glory of Japan. They were given new names, told to forget their language, and beaten if they resisted. Some were as young as 11. The army didn't care where they came from, only that they were healthy enough to be used. These were not isolated cases. The system was organized, calculated, and vast. The women were not comforts. They were property. Their bodies became weapons of war, used to control soldiers and keep morale high. But the recruiters never spoke of that. They smiled when they took the girls. They promised adventure, dignity, honor. They handed out slips of paper that meant nothing. And by the time the girls realized the truth, the trucks had no windows, and the doors were locked from the outside. They were loaded into trains, trucks, and ships, shoulder to shoulder, silent, eyes wide with fear. The girls did not know where they were going. Some rode for days through the mountains of Korea. Others crossed oceans to reach military camps in Burma, Manchuria, or the Dutch East Indies. Japanese soldiers barked orders in a language many could not understand. The air in the trucks was thick with sweat and sickness. Girls who cried were slapped. Those who asked questions were told to shut up and be grateful. One survivor, later interviewed in her 80s, recalled how she watched the countryside vanish behind her, her home swallowed by dust and smoke. She never saw her parents again. At night, they were dropped at checkpoints or makeshift way stations. There were no bathrooms, no food unless the guards gave it. Some bled between their legs, girls not old enough to understand why. The younger ones clung to older women, who sometimes whispered lies just to keep them calm. "It's just work," they said. "We'll be home soon." But the looks in their eyes betrayed the truth. They were afraid too. The journey itself became a kind of forgetting. Days blended together. The stars looked different. In the jungle, some girls were marched through rivers and leech-filled forests. In the mountains, they were hauled by mule or made to walk barefoot on frostbitten trails. At every stop, soldiers stared. Some laughed, others looked away, but none of them helped. When they finally arrived, they saw the stations. Small wooden buildings surrounded by barbed wire. Inside were beds made of stained mats, buckets in the corner for blood and urine, and windows too narrow to crawl through. The girls were told to wash. Uniforms were handed out: short skirts, loose blouses, thin undergarments. They were given numbers and instructions. One girl said she was handed a bucket and told to clean the room where the woman before her had died. Her blood was still on the floor. The officers spoke coldly. "You are here to serve the empire," they said. "Do your duty and you'll be safe." But safety never came. The journey ended, but the silence only deepened. In that silence, the girls realized something far worse than death had happened. They were no longer daughters, no longer students or sisters or children. They had been erased, repurposed, renamed, and in the stillness of those unfamiliar rooms, they waited for the first knock at the door. The door opened with the sound of boots. That was the only warning. The girls had barely adjusted to the strange rooms, the uniforms that didn't fit, the stares from passing soldiers. Then came the first night when everything changed forever. The man who entered was in full uniform. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Behind him, others waited in line, their helmets glinting under weak lantern light. The girl was 14. Her hands shook so badly she couldn't untie her blouse. So the soldier tore it. The others laughed. She remembered the sound more than the pain, boots against wood, laughter like knives. What happened next became the beginning of a nightmare that would repeat itself for months, sometimes years. On that first night, some girls fainted, others screamed. Some fought and were beaten bloody, and some, like the one who would later testify in court decades later, said she left her body entirely. Her mind floated above, watching herself from the ceiling, while her body was broken below. That disconnection, that numbness became a shield, one they all learned to wear. The military called it a comfort station, but there was no comfort, just a cot, a bowl of water, and the command to wash between each man. Some were forced to serve more than 20 in a single day. Bleeding was common, infection spread. When the girls cried, they were told to smile. When they collapsed, they were given pills to keep them awake. Birth control was rarely provided. Pregnancies were forced into abortion. Some girls were so badly injured on the first night that they couldn't stand, but there was no rest. The line never stopped, and the soldiers were always hungry. One woman remembered looking at the moon through a slit in the ceiling. She whispered to it like a god, begging to be taken away. Others carved tiny marks into the wood behind their beds, not to count the days, but to prove they still existed. They weren't allowed to speak their language. They weren't allowed to say no. Some tried to run. None got far. The punishment for escape was public: beating, starvation, or worse. One girl was tied to a post outside the station for 2 nights while soldiers spat at her. She died the next morning. Her body was buried behind the latrine. No name, no ceremony, just silence. And still, the line continued. The comfort women were told it was their duty, that the empire needed them, but what they were really serving was something far darker, a system that devoured them completely and left only shadows behind. Daylight became a rumor. Inside the comfort stations, time dissolved. The windows were narrow slits, meant only for air, never for escape. The girls lived by the rhythm of boots when they approached, when they stopped, when they retreated. Sleep came in fragments. Meals were cold rice or watery soup, sometimes not at all. Bathing was a luxury rarely granted. Blood dried on their thighs. Cloth was reused. Some girls no longer spoke. Others mumbled to themselves, trapped in loops of memory or prayer. They were called by numbers, not names. One woman remembered being referred to only as number 17 for over 2 years. Her real name disappeared. So did her language. Japanese orders filled the air. Resistance meant a slap, a kick, or worse. There was no kindness, not even in silence. The women were watched, regulated, broken down to the function of flesh. Illness spread fast. Gonorrhea, syphilis, tuberculosis. Some were given injections to keep working despite the sores. A few were taken away when they could no longer walk. They never returned. Rumors said they were executed. One survivor recalled the sound of screaming from behind the compound one night. Then nothing, just quiet. And the next morning, a new girl arrived. They came constantly young, frightened, confused. The system was fed by conquest. Every village that fell, every new occupation zone, meant more girls forced into service. They replaced the dead, the missing, the maimed. Pregnancies were not celebrated. If a girl was found with child, the station's medic would be called. Some performed crude abortions with no anesthesia. Others forced miscarriages with beatings. A few babies were born. Most didn't survive. A child was a problem. The women were not meant to be mothers. They were vessels emptied, used, refilled. The trauma layered over itself like scar tissue. Some girls forgot the sound of their own language. Others remembered songs but could no longer sing. In one station, a group of girls would hum together after dark, not lullabies, but a single shared note, long and low, like mourning through the walls. It was the only sound that belonged to them. Sometimes a soldier would return more than once. He might bring a sweet, a scrap of cloth. Some women clung to these moments as proof they were still human. Others hated the ones who tried to be gentle. There was no dignity in false affection, only confusion. And confusion, in that place, was just another way to suffer. The walls of the comfort stations held no clocks, no mirrors, no calendars, only shadows, only whispers. The girls began to forget who they were before. They didn't die all at once. They disappeared in pieces. When the war ended, no one opened the doors. There was no rescue, no declaration of freedom. Many comfort women only knew something had changed when the soldiers stopped coming. The boots no longer echoed. The lines disappeared. For some, it felt like a trick. They waited in silence, afraid to move, afraid it was another test. Others ventured outside, barefoot and trembling, into the wreckage of burned-out camps. Japanese officers had already fled. In some places, they shot the women before retreating. In others, they left them behind like broken tools. No goodbye, no explanation, just silence, again. Survivors crawled from stations into cities they didn't recognize, countries that no longer felt like home. Some were found by Allied troops and placed in refugee camps. Others were mistaken for Japanese collaborators and beaten by their own people. Many had no documents, no families waiting, no one to believe the truth. One woman returned to Korea only to be disowned by her father. He told her she had brought shame to the family. She never spoke to him again. Another tried to go back to school, but the whispers followed her filthy, ruined, comfort woman, so she stopped speaking entirely. Some women ended up in brothels again, not by force, but because they no longer knew how to live outside the system that had broken them. Others married men who never asked about the past. A few changed their names and vanished into the countryside. Many simply never made it home. Bodies were found near rivers, in fields, alone and unnamed. And still, the world moved on. Japan rebuilt. America celebrated victory. Korea and China struggled with new governments and old wounds. The comfort women were not mentioned in treaties or textbooks. They were erased by silence. Again, a handful of survivors began to write their stories down, but publishers refused them. Too shameful, too political, too much. The weight of what had happened stayed locked behind ribs and teeth. The war had ended on paper, but for these women, it kept living in nightmares, in infections that never healed, in children born and buried in secret. One woman later said that peace never came for her, only years of pretending, of enduring, of trying to build something out of what was left. She smiled at neighbors, she held her grandchildren, and every night she locked the door, just in case. Because the war had taught her one thing: when men arrive with smiles and promises, it's never just a visit. They called them liars. Decades after the war, when a few brave women stepped forward to tell the world what had been done to them, they were met with denial, dismissal, and disgust. Japan's government claimed the comfort stations were staffed by willing prostitutes. Officials insisted there had been no formal system of slavery. Some even said the women had profited. The truth was shredded in paper, erased from archives, and buried under layers of bureaucratic language. Survivors were told to stay quiet, told it was in the past, told they should be grateful to still be alive. But silence is not the same as peace, and forgetting is not the same as forgiveness. The Japanese military had burned thousands of records near the end of the war. Comfort stations vanished, testimonies disappeared. For years, schoolchildren in Japan were never taught about the women. The term comfort woman itself was a euphemism, a soft word hiding a brutal system. It allowed people to speak about rape without saying the word. It made the girls sound complicit. Survivors were blamed for their own suffering. Many stayed silent because of shame, fear, or because no one had ever asked. In Korea, families turned their backs on daughters who returned from the stations. In the Philippines, some women lived alone for the rest of their lives, never marrying, never speaking of what happened. In China, a woman who had been taken at 13 spent 50 years pretending she had been a nurse. When she finally confessed, her own grandchildren called her a traitor. Some tried to sue. A few traveled to Tokyo, demanding acknowledgement, apology, and reparations. They were met with protests, nationalist threats, and government spokesmen who bowed politely and said nothing. The world had moved on. The economy was booming. No one wanted ghosts from the past dragging down the future. In museums, the women's stories were left out. In textbooks, their existence was reduced to a footnote if mentioned at all. It was as if their pain had been too inconvenient to remember. But it was never forgotten by the women themselves. The trauma lived in their bones, in the way they folded laundry, in how they kept the doors locked at night. It shaped the way they held their daughters, how they looked at strangers. Even in silence, it screamed. To be erased after surviving the unthinkable is its own kind of violence. And for the comfort women, survival did not end with the war. It became a second sentence, a life of pretending nothing had happened, while knowing too well that everything had. She was 77 when she finally spoke. Her voice trembled, but not from age, from memory. In a crowded press conference in Seoul, Kim Hak-sun stood before the cameras and told the truth the world had long refused to hear. She had been a comfort woman. Taken at 17, raped by dozens of soldiers every day, held captive until the end of the war. Her testimony cracked something open. It was as if her voice gave breath to thousands of others who had buried their stories for too long. Slowly, carefully, more women stepped forward. They shared their names. They showed their scars. They told stories that had been locked behind silence for over 50 years. Some could barely speak above a whisper. Others wept. But they told the world what Japan had done. The testimonies were impossible to ignore. Footage of elderly women describing systematic rape by military personnel made international headlines. Protests followed. Every Wednesday, survivors gathered outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul, holding signs, holding each other, demanding apology. They became known as the Wednesday demonstrators. They brought their walkers, their wheelchairs, their trembling hands. Rain or shine, they came. Statues were built in their honor, young girls cast in bronze, seated beside empty chairs, symbolizing those who never came home. But Japan's official stance barely shifted. Apologies were issued, then walked back. Funds were offered, but without admitting legal responsibility. Nationalists attacked the statues, calling them shameful. One Japanese mayor said the women had been professional prostitutes. Another called the comfort system necessary. Survivors were forced to relive their trauma not just through memory, but through the fresh wound of denial. Still, they kept speaking. In classrooms, on stages, in courtrooms, and before the United Nations. They carried photographs of themselves as young girls, held up next to faces lined with age. They pointed to the gap between the two images the years stolen. Some died before they could see even a shadow of justice. Others lived just long enough to know their voices had moved the earth, even if only slightly. One woman said she didn't want revenge, just truth. Another said she wanted no apology, only for Japan to teach its children what happened. Not to create shame, but to prevent repetition. Memory is a weapon, she whispered. But only if you use it. Their words continue to echo, long after many of them are gone. And though the world can never return what was taken, their stories now stand where silence once ruled. Somewhere in Seoul, there is a small bronze statue of a girl. She sits on a wooden chair, her hands resting gently on her lap, her eyes staring forward. Her feet are bare. Beside her is an empty seat. Tourists pass by, snap photos, and keep walking. But those who know, those who truly see, understand that the statue is not just a symbol. It is a grave, not of a body, but of silence. Around the world, similar statues have appeared. In Manila, in San Francisco, in Berlin. And still, they are met with outrage from those who wish the past would stay buried. But history never stays buried. It waits. It whispers. It returns in the voices of the last survivors, in the pages of journals discovered in attics, in court documents and classroom debates. The comfort women are almost all gone now. Most died without apology. Some were buried without names. Yet their stories remain, not because governments chose to preserve them, but because the women did. They remembered. They told. They endured. and in doing so, they carved their truth into the world with a strength that outlived them. For decades, their lives were considered too dirty, too shameful to be part of history. But now, we know better. Shame does not belong to the women who were used. It belongs to the men who used them and to the systems that protected them. Each survivor who spoke did so knowing the cost. They were mocked, threatened, accused of lying, but they did it anyway, because silence had already stolen enough. One woman said she wanted her story told not so the world would pity her, but so it would never again allow girls to be taken in the name of glory. We were not comfort, she said. We were children, and now they are remembered as such, not as prostitutes, not as traitors, as daughters, sisters, students, human beings. Memorials rise, not just in stone, but in books, in films, in the trembling voices of students reciting their names aloud in class. What was once denied is now undeniable. What was once erased is now carved into history, and though the comfort women are fewer with each passing year, their resistance remains, not in guns, not in fire, but in memory, in truth, in the power to say, even now, we were here, we lived, and we will not be forgotten. If this story moved you, remember their names. Share this with someone who still doesn't know what happened. And if you believe history should never be rewritten by silence, subscribe to Forgotten Stories Ancient World, because some stories don't fade unless we let them.